Hello, welcome to the Tucson Festival of Books 2024. My name is Carl, and I work with the Pima County Public Library. And this is our first teen author interview of the day. And we have a group from City High, and they are going to interview Jasmine Skye about their book, Daughter of the Bone Forest. So take it away.
So my name is Romeo, and the first question I have is just like, if while writing it, were there any characters that you like especially connected with or anything? Because they were all like very interesting, different people. So.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I have a lot of characters in Daughter of the Bone Forest, as y'all know, and I love all of them for different reasons. Even the villains and the enemies and the bullies, you know, I get attached to the characters that I write regardless. But I think the one that was the most fun for me to write was Ackelman, who's my like cryptic seer character. They were so much fun to try to write and to figure out like, okay, how would they, you know, give little hints to things they know without actually directly stating it. So they were my favorite.
I'm Annalie, and I wanted to ask if you had a specific character that you like struggled with writing the most.
Yeah, probably also Ackelman, because they are the cryptic seer. No, if not for Ackelman, actually, so this book is what I would call semi-dual POV, right? So most of the book is in Rosie's point of view, the main character, and then every fifth chapter we switch to Shaw's point of view, who's my love interest, and that was a very late addition. So the first, 6 drafts of this book was just Rosie's point of view. It didn't have Shaw. But then my editor wanted to sort of add more Shaw in, and that was a whole thing that we added later, and I love it now. I love having her point of view because here's a little hint to the future. Book 2 is Shaw's book. So book 2 is going to be primarily Shaw's point of view with a little bit of Rosie scattered in. So because of that, my editor was like, let's get a little bit of Shaw so that readers aren't like shocked when it like suddenly switches over. But I had to then figure out what Shaw's voice was kind of late into the process, which was difficult. It took multiple tries of writing sort of different variations of her first couple POV chapters before I think I settled on it. And now I'm writing book 2, and it's so much easier because I already know Shaw's voice, so it worked out in the end. But yeah.
Cool.
Well, I'm Evelyn, and these two asked about characters, and I just want to say Charles is my favorite. I live for him to get bullied and like knock down a few pegs. Like every time Rosie was like standing up to him, it just made me giggle so much. But then the question that I have is, how did you decide on the ending? Like, I feel like you were building up to it for a lot of the book, and that's kind of connected to my second question. But like, did you know that that's how the first book was going to end the whole time?
Yes, so I am someone who writes to the climax. When I come up with a story, the first thing I come up with is my setting and my magic. That's like, I'm a world building geek. I love world building. So I came up with that first. The Cursed Kingdom was the first thing that I developed. And then once I had that, I was like, so what's the story that is being told in this setting, right? And I figured out the ending first. Now, I figured out the ending of the series first, not the ending of this book. So I did have to work backwards and figure out like what was going to be the climax of this book. And when you're trying to figure that out, you're like, okay, so what are the main themes? What are the main obstacles that, you know, Rosie as a character is dealing with? This book, like I said, is her book. Book 2 is Shaw's book. So the primary sort of arc of Rosie's character arc needs to be done, or like 2/3 of the way there in this book. Shaw's, this is how I say it. I see Rosie's arc is like 2/3 of the way done, and then the final third will be done in book 2. And Shaw's arc is like 1/3 of the way done, and then the other 2/3 have to be done in book 2, right? But because Rosie kind of like hits sort of the climax of her character arc in this book, I had to figure out like what is the you know, tensest obstacle that I could put in her way for the climax, and so that's how I came up with, without spoiling what it is, y'all know, but for any listeners who haven't read it yet, that's why the climax became what it is for this book. Is that your question?
Yeah, that answered the question really well.
Yeah. Okay.
And so this is a trilogy, right? This is going to be a trilogy.
It's actually a duology.
Oh, nice.
So there is probably enough content in this story that it could have been a trilogy, but it was kind of like an awkward, this was a conversation I had with my editor, was like duology versus trilogy. And because it's Rosie's book and Shaw's book, it just made sense to kind of make it Rosie's book and Shaw's book and make it a duology and finish it there. I will say book 2 is going to be quite long because there's a lot of stuff to do. There's a lot of time. This book takes place over 3 months. Book 2 will take place over 6 months. So it's like double in some ways the length, but not a fully double the length, obviously.
And
So.
I want to give you props for your ending because it definitely left me wanting more. Like, I want to hear what Pops is gonna say.
Yes, there's a little bit of a cliffhanger, or maybe a lot of a cliffhanger. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if I can give the readers a sneak peek into the first chapter or two of book 2 early, because it's going to be, another year plus before book 2 comes out. But
And then you touched on this a little bit when you mentioned the Cursed Kingdom. You talk about a lot of the titles and like the titles for the like powerful magic users have a lot of negative connotations, like the Cursed Kingdom or Death's Heir. And I feel like that was really good foreshadowing for the ending of the book, but is there anything specific that you wanted readers to take away from this kind of negative connotations of the titles?
yeah, so the way that we, put connotations in words, right, is societally developed. So one of the things I was doing with the Cursed Kingdom was I was creating a kingdom that like kind of all the other nations around it don't like, right? So this is a magical sanctuary that is a place for witches and familiars from all over the known world can kind of flee to and find their place. And because of that, it's almost a discussion of like in-group language and the way that like people can reclaim words that are associated as negative, for the general public, right? So curses, while they are still bad, like curses are not a good thing in this world, the Cursed Kingdom has kind of like reclaimed that identity as like, yeah, we were cursed, but now we're taking hold, we're reclaiming this curse that was done to make this land magical, and we're gonna, make it our own, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's
I'm Alex. Question I had for you is, what was your goal for readers to take away from the book?
I really, really love talking about power and the way that power sort of intersects across different lines. And this book, so Rosie is a very powerful familiar. She can shapeshift into a lot of different bone animals. And Shaw is a very powerful bone witch. She is Death's Heir. She has this very strong natural skill with necromancy, right? So they're both very powerful, and there are other witches and familiars in this world who are not as magically gifted. But Shaw is also very powerful politically and socially. She is the princess. She has a lot of, sway with people and in the school and things like that. And yet she has been prophesized to lead this war that is coming. So she has no power over her own future. She has a complete lack of agency when it comes to the things that she's expected to do. She's expected to take the throne. She's expected to, lead the kingdom into this prophesized war that is very scary, obviously for the kingdom because of all the consequences that war can bring. Rosie, meanwhile, has no political or social power. She comes from a tiny little town. She, has absolutely no weight in the social scene of the school, and yet she has complete power and agency over her future, and that's kind of the push and pull of this book. So I wanted readers to come out of this book really reflecting upon the power that they had, the power that, they bring, and the different vectors of power, because I think we can often tunnel vision on the things that we are powerless in and not realize, just like Rosie doesn't realize the power that she does have, right? And so she kind of tunnels on being bitter about, not having sort of this social power at times, or not having the power to save her family, when in reality she has quite a lot of power, and if she learns how to use the power she does have, then things might happen, So, yeah.
Was there anything that helped inspire the book or inspire you to write in general?
So I was inspired to write to answer this question. I was inspired to write back in 4th grade when I went to my school library and picked up the first Tamara Pierce novel, Alana, The First Adventure. So the Tortall universe is like this medieval fantasy. It was the very first medieval fantasy I had ever read in my life. And it's also one of the first series that had any openly queer characters, that had any characters of color. I mean, I grew up in a time where there was no diversity in fantasy, especially. So I was always inspired to write fantasy, and specifically write fantasy with sort of these larger, more diverse casts, and to showcase queer heroes getting to have their own, exciting adventures. This book specifically, though, was inspired when I took a work trip to Oregon in 2019, and the setting of the Cursed Kingdom is inspired by Oregon. All of the, lands, the Bone Forest and the Frozen Mountain and Lake Bloom are all inspired by real physical locations in Oregon, and then I added magic to them.
Cool.
Yeah.
So hi, I'm Ellie.
Hi.
You kind of already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. What inspired the Bone Forest, and why did you decide to make it sentient?
Yeah, so here's the story of what happened. So I'm there in Oregon for a work trip. We're about to head up to Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood. We're going to go take a ski lift up to the top of Mount Hood. And that's what inspired the Cursed Kingdom, literally standing on top of Mount Hood and surveying, northern Oregon. I was like, I'm going to set a kingdom here. But the Bone Forest in particular was inspired by the scene before we get there, where we're kind of at the base of Mount Hood, and there's these deep, huge pine trees in this very large pine forest that's just kind of swooping down from the side of the mountain and over these rolling hills of Oregon, right? And there was this very low-lying fog that was going through the trees, so it wasn't hovering over the trees. We could still see the tops of these pine trees, and the fog was just kind of seeping through the trees. That is so cool. Let me write a forest that has this fog that is just seeping through it. And then the question about how do I decide to make the Bone Forest sentient, I think is always something that I've loved, is lands that have a personality, lands that have a character. So when I was starting to write the Bone Forest, it became more and more sentient with every draft. The early drafts, it was just kind of a creepy forest, and then progressively over the 7 drafts this book went through, it grew more and more powerful in that way, and grew more and more like a character that has a very special relationship with Rosie. And so that fog that was rolling through it is something that the forest can actually control, and the trees, the bone pines, are actually able to move and be the arms of this forest character. And I just, once I sort of developed the forest, I then had to bring that out to the other lands. So the Frozen Mountain is the same, Lake Bloom is the same, the Obsidian Desert. In this book, you only get to see the Bone Forest and Lake Bloom, but in book 2, you'll get to see the Obsidian Desert and the Frozen Mountain, and kind of explore these new, powerful settings in the Cursed Kingdom. And that's honestly my favorite scenes to write, are those setting pieces.
So the questions I have written down you sort of already covered, because you talked about having this long-standing interest in the fantasy genre, but I was wondering also if there are any other genres that you're considering exploring in the future. Obviously you're working on the sequel now, but
yeah, that is a great question. Fantasy is my one true love, and I will never go far from fantasy. But specifically, I write YA fantasy because when I was a teenager, I, scoured every library and bookstore trying to find any fantasy adventures with queer characters, and there just wasn't any, pretty much at all. So I write my YA fantasy for my teenage self, and I hope that teenagers today, are able to take something from it, and any of the adults who read it as well. It's a little bit of a way to heal child me, and I will, for the next decade at least, continue to write YA fantasy, but I am also working on an adult sci-fi debut, so I love science fiction. I want to write my fun queer science fiction as well, and I'll dip into the adult space for that, so yeah.
I love sci-fi, so I'll keep an eye out for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for aspiring writers?
I think that my number one advice is to, I have a couple different pieces of advice. So the one that I think a lot of aspiring writers aspiring authors hear about is, keep persevering. It is a hard industry to get into, and it is a field where, like any field, the more that you do, the better that you get, right? I don't know if y'all have heard of the theory of 10,000 hours. You need to do 10,000 hours in something in order to become a master at it. And it takes a long time to write 10,000 hours worth of story. But one thing that a lot of young writers or less experienced writers do that I certainly did is that you'll start a book or a story, and then you kind of like get bored maybe 30% of the way in, and then you go write something else. So I highly always recommend to just push through. Just figure out what you're going to do, how you're going to end it, even if you're going to end it maybe a little sooner than you had originally planned, because the more endings you write, the better you'll get at endings. And if you only ever write the beginning, you'll never get good at endings. But then my other piece of advice is to, write what you love. If you are super obsessed with a show, like dip into fanfic. If you are super obsessed with, different conventions, different tropes, then write them, and don't worry about like what might be marketable to sell or what might be considered weird or whatever it is. Just enjoy putting everything that you love into a story, because that's what will keep you interested through writing that ending, right?
I have a question for you, but before that question, I have another question.
Go ahead.
In the book, the queer character, like queerness is almost a norm, it feels. And I was just curious, what do you think the value is in having queerness be the norm in your fantasy world versus having it be more adjacent to our world,
our reality? Yeah. So yes, this is a queer normative world, and I think there is value in books that showcase homophobia and transphobia and all of those things. There's value in that because it is a reality in our world. But I wanted to, like I said, write fun, magical adventures where the conflict was not ever the queerness or the gender of the characters. This is both a queer normative world and a non-patriarchal world. So people of any gender can be in positions of power, and there's like no issue with that whatsoever in this world, because I don't think it should be an issue in our world. So in some ways I'm modeling what I want to see in this book, and also trying to show that you can still have plenty of conflict without the conflict being about the queerness or the gender, right? And there's not enough queer normative fantasy. I got asked that question at my launch for this book, like what are my favorite YA queer normative stories, and I was able to list like 2 authors that do it. It's just not very prevalent, and especially in the teen space, I think is so important to kind of, again, showcase, model like what we hope to be able to bring about for our futures in this reality. So
yeah, I definitely agree with that. I feel like there's a bit of fear mongering that comes with queer media that like excessively displays queer phobia, and I really like that about the book.
thank you.
What questions have you always wanted to be asked in an interview?
Oh, I think y'all asked great questions, so I can't think of anything like super big that I think you're missing. You could ask me, or I guess something I've never been asked. I should have pre-thought what my answer was to this question. I don't think I've ever been asked why I chose the sort of delineation between the different, so in this world, right, we have these 4 different magical types, and each of the magical types is associated kind of with an element, but also the familiars of that magical type are associated with a type of animal. So flower familiars, who are associated with the healing witches, they can turn into aquatic animals, and the ice familiars turn into birds, and the glass familiars turn into reptiles, and the bone familiars turn into land mammals. I don't think anyone has ever asked me why I made those choices.
Why?
Because I came up with the setting first. So I knew the types of magic that the witches would have in each of the types, right? I was like, I know I want a healing type of magic, and I know I want the, being able to see the future type of magic, and I want the being able to talk with the dead and work with the dead, and I want the sort of making enchantments and things like that. And I chose those magical types because those are all associated with what I would consider like real witchcraft, like people who practice, witchcraft in our reality. Those are kind of like the 4 types of witchcraft that you can practice. So I was like, let me take those real witchcraft ideas and then dial it up to 1,000 and, you know, make it bigger. Obviously, no one's going around in our reality raising an army of corpses, right? But like, we have people who can like talk to the spirits of the dead or help their loved ones kind of like, you know, grieve people who have passed. And so that's what I did with the witches. And then I was like, okay, so each of those witches has like a familiar type. And so when I came up with the lands, I was like, I know I want the bone forest. And in my brain, the frozen mountain is because it's like can see all, right? You get up to the top of the mountain, you see everything. So those are the people that can see the future. That makes sense, right? And when I think of like the healing witches and like potion making, I think of plants. So that was like, okay, let's think of like a lake with this like underwater garden. That made sense to me. And then the final sort of setting that was based off of Oregon is the Oregon High Desert. And sort of near the High Desert, you have what's called the Newberry Caldera, which has these obsidian flow hikes. I was like, what if I made a desert that was made out of obsidian glass and obsidian sand dunes? You'll see this in book 2. So I was like, okay, well, the final category of witches who can like enchant stuff, like this kind of makes sense. Like you can use glass to make like tokens and runes and stuff like that. So these all fit. Okay, so now I have the settings and I have the witches. So what are the familiars gonna be, right? And so I was like, well, obviously the mountain. When I think of mountains and think of high up things, I think of birds. So that those became the birds. And again, you see the future, you're up high, you have this like aerial view, makes sense. And then the water with the lake, well, it's a lake, so they gotta be able to swim underwater, so we'll make them fish and crabs and stuff like that. And the desert, when I think of deserts, I think of reptiles, so that's that. So then I was left with the bone animals, and I was like, well, I guess the only thing that's left is mammals and land animals, so that's what they became. It was just a puzzle piece, putting it all together.
And so we did some research, and on your website we found the BuzzFeed quiz. Have you taken it? And what did you get?
It. Yes, I am a bone witch, which I was shocked about. I assumed throughout writing this entire book that I was an ice familiar. I love birds. I have like, if I were to, be able to shapeshift into any animal, I want to shapeshift into like a red-tailed hawk. So I was like, obviously that means I'm an ice familiar. No, I'm apparently a bone witch. It does fit. I just didn't want to admit that it fits because I am not very similar to Shaw at all. But obviously Shaw is not like the only bone witch in the story. So what are y'all?
I always forget mine, but I got the same as Romeo.
Yeah, we're both ice witches.
Okay, I love that.
I know.
I'm a flower familiar.
Oh, good.
I'm a flower witch.
Okay.
I haven't been able to take it yet. I was going to speed take it before you entered, and then you entered.
It's fine. Yeah, no, if anyone listening wants to take it, you can find the link on my website, or you can just Google it, BuzzFeed, what kind of witch or familiar are you? And it was so much fun to create. I had a lot of friends, like, beta test it for me to see what everyone would be, and it was super fun to come up with like what characteristics each type would be. I had to make, there's a magic school, I had to make a sorting quiz, right?
Yeah.
So
I was really happy with my result because
Yeah.
it really fit, and like my 2 favorite characters are the 2 flower witches, Yuyin and Shanti. So.
I love that. I also love Yuyin and Shanti. Though I will say, you asked me who my favorite character was. I usually answer Ackelman. Guan Yu, the flower familiar.
Yeah.
I love Guan Yu. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that crushed me.
I might have hurt myself with that one also. I'll blame my editor.
And I have one more question. So you talked about originally you just wrote the book in Rosie's perspective, and then you added in some Shaw. And I was wondering if, since you wrote Rosie in first person and Shaw in third person, if you had a particular reason for doing that.
So originally, when I added Shaw in, she was in first person. And as we were sort of going through what's called past pages and line edits and things like it's line edits and then past pages, line edits, then copy edits, then past. But there's a lot of steps to getting a book published. I found it, and I've always personally not really liked books that have dual POV or triple POV, and they're all in first person, because it can just be so difficult to realize that you've switched point of view. And even though I have chapter headings when the POV is switching, it's like a lot of work to try to make that first sentence make it very obvious that you've switched into the new person, and I found it clunky, honestly. So I asked my editor if we could take Shaw's POV to third person, and I also liked it because Shaw in this book is meant to feel distant. I've seen some early reviews that talk about how like they felt so much more closer to Rosie than they did to Shaw, and I was like, perfect, that's what I want. Shaw is meant to feel a little bit, back. She's the logical character. She's the one that tries not to be very emotional about things, and then throughout the book, sort of like steps into her emotions a little bit more. And so now when we switch to book 2, we'll get to see like Shaw step into that very emotional side of herself and be in that first person, very close point of view. And Rosie is now the one that's like being a little bit more logical, a little bit more like, okay, what do we have to do to deal with the challenges of book 2? So it worked out, even though at the beginning it was just because I didn't like them both being in first person.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I really like
Yeah.
the idea of using different perspectives, like
Yeah.
create, I don't know, show the difference between characters.
People do it. It's a technique that's used in adult fiction a lot. It's not
Yeah.
used in YA very much, but there's some really great examples. N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy uses this to great effect. The first book of that trilogy has a first-person point of view, a third-person point of view, and a second-person point of view.
Mhm.
And those are the 3 POVs. And so I've always kind of wanted to play with that. So it was a great opportunity to do that. Yeah.
Also, I know while reading it, we were talking about the courting system quite a
Yes,
bit.
yes, we were.
We were both like, wouldn't it be so nice if someone like expressed their feelings and then they just left me alone for a few days? So how did you come up with that?
Great question. I took kind of like the typical rules that you would have seen in like Victorian England, and then I changed them for what would have made sense for this world. So I started everything in this book. I started with something that is reality, and then I erased that, and then did something that made more sense for this universe. So when I was coming up with the courting steps, I was like, okay, so what would be the number one thing that witches and familiars would look towards to decide if they should be together? And it was like magical compatibility. The whole point of the witch-familiar bond is that once you bond, you share magic and you're both able to get stronger for it. So if your magic is not compatible, then that wouldn't work. And in fact, in this universe, I don't really go into it, but if you aren't compatible and you want to try to bond anyway, the bond has a really hard time taking because it's like oil and water that doesn't want to mesh together. So I've seen some people, some reviewers and people saying that Rosie and Shaw are like fated mates, which I never really intended for them to be soulmates, but they do have extraordinarily compatible magic, and what that means for their potential to be together is, again, there's a question here about choice. So this is a story with prophecy and this prophesized war, and the question that will especially come up in book 2 is, do you fight that destiny or do you not? And Rosie and Shaw are in some ways almost prophesized to be together. No, they're not, but they have very, very compatible magic, and so Rosie has to make the choice. Does she give in to that? Or does she not, and why? And making those decisions is a big part of the agency for both of these characters in this story. So I love the courtship though. I love writing courtship.
Also, so you break the norm about like a witch and familiar bond. Are you planning to ever break the norm of like people in the same element, like an ice familiar and a glass witch, or?
So that is a great question. It is an issue that I came across as I was writing and editing and looking to book 2, because the answer is, like, I never want to write a system that says, in the way that some people in our reality would like to say, that, like, queer relationships are wrong because they're not natural. It's not natural in this book for people across elements to be together, and it is not actually physically possible for someone of a different type, like a bone witch and a flower familiar could not, again, it's the magical compatibility, they could not physically bond, but they could be in a relationship. There's nothing stopping them from falling in love and being together, even though they wouldn't be able to make a magical bond, right? There's nothing stopping a witch from falling in love with someone who doesn't have magic, or a familiar from falling. So there's that. it is not something that became a highlight of this book. Maybe if I ever write another book in this universe, so not with these characters, but in the universe, it's something I've considered going into because I think it is an interesting sort of subculture that must exist in this universe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I found that really interesting because it's like a queer normative society was created, and then there's almost this new form of queerness, like
Yes.
represented,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's just interesting to see.
Humans always like to find ways to make rules that maybe
Yeah.
shouldn't exist. So yeah.
I have two questions about the courting. So the first question is, in this world, it seems very normalized for like teenagers to find their like magic bond, like as they're teenagers, and bond seems almost like marriage. What made you decide to like find that soul life partner so early? Like it is strategic because of the magic, but like
So it's a combination of things. One, it's a YA. And as you know, in YAs, the characters are often finding the love of their lives as teenagers. Is that realistic? Probably not. But it's a YA. And I have strong opinions about the way that YA tends to push characters together really early, so I created a system to make myself feel better about it, which is to say that because the magical bond sort of like has a little extra spin to it, in fact, it's mentioned in chapter 30 of this book when Shaw is reflecting upon the bonding system and reflecting upon the fact that witches and familiars do often like come together really quickly and can decide very, very quickly in only a couple months if this is the person they want to be with for the rest of their life. It's a little bit magically influenced by the bond. And that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have to work on their relationship and continue to find new ways to come together like any relationship in our world. But the bond certainly like gets rid of a lot of those early stage like do I not like this person, that, or not the bond so much, but the magical compatibility in the courtship.
And then my second question about courtship is also about the class difference between Shaw and Rosie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, part of the courting process is that usually the person of the higher class gives their the person they want to bond with a necklace, and then if you accept it, you have to give the same necklace back. And like Shaw gave Rosie this incredibly expensive, like rare jewel, silver encrusted thing. How is Rosie supposed to like find a matching necklace for that?
So this is
And they didn't end up bonding, but
we'll see what happens in book 2. It is always meant to be a slow burn series. Despite writing a system that things happen very quickly, I was like, but actually, this is me being a gray ace person, being like on the asexual spectrum, because I never like those like very quick insta-love stories because I don't get it. So that's why it's a slow burn. That was Shaw's blind spot. So Shaw has had this courtship necklace for a very long time. She's just been waiting for the person to give it to, and like every familiar she's basically like politically been asked to consider would be someone who would be able to afford a matching courtship necklace. And then she sees Rosie and she kind of throws it all out the window, kind of last minute, and gives this necklace to her and does not think through the fact that Rosie would not be able to afford a matching courtship necklace. And that is an issue of the classism, and that is a very pointed thing, and that is something that they will have to figure out should they maybe possibly get back together in book 2. So
Yeah.
Something I was just thinking about while you were talking is like you kind of touched on like the difference of like a bond versus like being in love with someone. I was just wondering if you could like talk about that more, and also specifically I was wondering like, I don't know if you've considered this at all, but like would it be possible to have like a platonic bond in their world?
Yeah, great question. It is, so I believe in different types of love, right? Obviously there are even what we like to call romantic love. Like there are different flavors to romantic love. You do have to have an emotional connection. There has to be trust to bond with someone. Could you have that trust, that oxytocin with someone that you are not maybe interested in like being with in other ways romantically. Again, this comes down to like the way that we like to combine romance and like sexual attraction, which are not the same thing. And I think that anyone who is bonded in this universe has to love each other. But what they do with that love is kind of up to them, right? The society wants to see that bond as marriage, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And that is another question that if I ever wrote another book in this universe, I would like to explore more detail. I just don't have enough room, y'all.
I think you touched on it a little bit with, I forget their name, in Shaw's entourage, who's in love with
Shanti.
another witch.
So
And
Yu
Shaw
Yan,
like expected Yuyan to have a platonic bond.
so Shaw doesn't expect Yu Yan to have a platonic bond. She expects Yu Yan to choose a flower familiar to join the entourage. Yu Yan does not want a flower familiar. She's a flower witch, and the way the entourage is set up is you're supposed to have one of every type. So Yu Yan is expected to choose a partner to be the flower familiar of the entourage. Shaw does not care if they're bonded. Other people in society probably would care, but Shaw doesn't. So the question is, because Yu Yan is not interested in familiars and there is a way for two witches to bond, will Yu Yan is probably more likely to want to bond with a witch, but just have sort of a platonic, unbonded partner that's on the entourage with her. And perhaps that is a fairer method than forcing the entourage to all have to be together. This is an issue of, there's a lot of things in this world that are not perfect that I also see as like, this is a medieval fantasy. If we take this world and give it another 500 years, like how would those social norms have changed, right? Yeah.
I was curious with like the systems of like class and race in the sense of like familiars, witches, you know? Are those systems inspired by like our real or like our American society? Is there like certain societies that's inspired by? Or
I think that as authors, we can often fall into a trap when we're creating what's called a secondary world. So, I base this off Oregon, but it's its own thing. It is not based in any true reality that our world has ever had. But I like to work from the real and work up. So I set this in kind of almost a colonialist setting. I was thinking like the Salem witch trials. This is set in America. Like, let me look into that time period and sort of, the social norms of that time period and then build off of that. So that's where I started. So yes, it is in many ways a very American fantasy versus I think a lot of fantasies are very European coded. And I wanted to play with something that was set in the Americas and sort of American, the way American culture has grown from the colonies on. But I also wanted to make it my own thing, so it has a little of both. Yeah.
So this might be too specific of a question, but have you ever read The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenson?
I've read The Night Circus, but I have
Okay.
not picked up her newest book yet.
I read The Starless Sea, I think either right before or right after or during when I was reading this book, and I found a lot of comparisons from the Bone Forest to the bees in
Okay.
The Starless Sea, so I highly recommend that book because
I will pick it
I
up.
liked that connection. Like, especially, I think at the very end, the sentient trees said something almost to I think it was to Shaw that sounded a lot like how the bees spoke in that book. So I think you would appreciate that.
I will definitely, it's been on my list because I do love Erin Morgenstern's writing. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, like, earlier you were talking about, like, real world magic, kind of, and then, like, when you were talking about all the different, like, types of magic in the world, I was noticing while reading it that there's a lot of, like, connections to paganism in your
Mhm.
world. I was just curious how that, like, came about, and, like, I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it is based on that. So both of my grandmothers, my maternal and paternal grandmother, are what I would consider like, they would never call themselves practicing witches, but in the ways of like what other people would consider witchcraft is what they do. So my paternal grandmother is a therapist. She's got a degree, in counseling, and so she helps people out the way that any talk therapist would help people out, but she also can talk to the dead. and can, do things. I have so many crazy stories that you may or may not believe, and whether or not they're placebo effect or whatever you want to, you know what I mean? But things that like she could never have known, that she is able to then like, talk with her clients about, their dead loved ones and things like that. So I grew up with that. And then my maternal grandmother is a craniosacral therapist. So she was a practicing nurse for a very long time. She has sort of like the physical healing side of things. And then she also has this like more esoteric, like metaphysical healing that she does for her clients. And she's worked with like professional basketball players, and she does things like she will have professional sports players who will like consistently keep like spraining a wrist over and over and over again, and the doctors can like only do so much, and once you've kind of weakened a part of your body, then it just like often likes to get re-injured, and then they'll go to her and she'll basically just like touch their wrist and kind of sit there and send it like healing energy for 15 minutes. They'll never sprain it again. So I was like, I grew up with this magic, with this real magic. And so when I decided I wanted to write a witch book, I was like, I want to write a witch book that is based off of the real magic that is in our world. And again, whether you want to consider it just like placebo effect or not, it doesn't, the placebo effect is its own form of magic. The fact that the placebo effect exists is a form of magic, in my opinion. That our brains are able to create this reality just because we believe it is reality. So that's where I built off of it.
I lost it.
I get that.